My name is Jody Chiera. I'm the Education Director here at K-Motion, joined by Jason Mish, who's also part of the education team. Jason, do you want to just give a quick background on yourself?
Based out of Washington, D.C. area. Background is in sports medicine, but then biomechanics, exercise physiology. I've been working with 3D systems for about 15 years. Captured probably in the neighborhood of, I think I'm up to about 30,000 swings on 3D.
Great. So we're going to talk to you this morning in this presentation about correlating body motion and wrist motion to the effects on the club. Before we get into that, Jason and I are going to take about 5 minutes and talk about a couple new features we have with our product, the evaluation tool, and most recently our tile display, which is extremely exciting in terms of the user interface and how you would use it in a lesson with your students. So we'll quickly go through this. I know some of you have probably seen the evaluation before, but we'll just take a quick peek through it. The evaluation tool's most importantly going to give you a lot of information right at your fingertips. So if you're not comfortable going into graphs or you don't like to do that in a golf lesson because the students don't really understand what the graphs are, now what we've done with the evaluation tool is we've taken a lot of that information that you'd have to go into the graphs to see out of the graphs at your fingertips in this report. You can compare swing to swing and club to club. Okay, so that's really important to note because now we're not just looking at one swing at a time. We're looking at 5 swings for a 6-iron, 5 swings for a driver. You can compare those 5 swings of that one club to each other, as well as toggle back and forth very easily and start to compare your iron to your driver so that you can start to see how your players' patterns might change or stay the same depending upon the club. The first page of the evaluation is our overview page. So on the overview page, you'll see you're presented with 2 scores. One is a speed creation score. The other is a consistency score. So that's going to give you the player's scores for those swings in relationship to a peer range. Okay, so that peer range comes from a very close collaboration with Dr. Rob Neal of BioSwing Dynamics and his database of over 4,000 students. So that peer range is broken down by age and gender, and that's what we're comparing your players to when we are comparing them to that peer range. You also have 2 areas right below those scores that are blank when it pops up on your web browser, comment section and next steps. So you can type in, when it's in the web browser, you can type in anything you want in there related to comments from that lesson and then next steps for take-home homework for that student. And when you download that as a PDF, those comments will be in there. So when you email it or print it out for your students, they'll have that right in front of them. The swing characteristics page, so you'll see there's a chart on the right-hand side. You'll be able to see 6 swing characteristics right now, okay? And it's going to tell you whether those swing characteristics are present at all, and if they are present, whether they're minor or major. Okay, so you'll be able to see the severity of that characteristic within your player. Consistency. Consistency is going to give you the standard deviation at address, top, and impact for each body segment and each movement of that body segment. So for the upper body and the pelvis, it'll give you the bend, side bend, and rotation, and for wrist, it will give you flexion, extension, and deviation. Position averages. We have the averages at the top in the darker shaded boxes. That's going to be the average for those 5 swings of the club that they had in their hand, whether it be the 6-iron or the driver. And then it will compare them to the pro range below that. Then we dive into the individual positions of address, top, and impact. A little bit deeper, you'll see in the middle column there, you have it says you, that's your player that you're evaluating. You'll be able to see their averages again and a number of blue dots on that vertical line. Closer together, more consistent they were. Further apart, the less consistent they were. You have the pro range in the orange on the left, and you've got the peer range in the light blue on the right. Our speeds page, you'll see there's at the top, you have the averages of the 5 swings of the speeds of each segment in relationship to that orange bar, which is the pro range. And then it breaks it down swing by swing in the chart below that so that you can see the individual swings and the speeds of each segment compared to the pro and the peer again. Sequence and timing. Top chart's going to give you transition sequence order for all 5 swings. Bottom chart's going to give you peak speed sequence order for all 5 swings. And then finally we have our tempo page. So this will give you the overall time it took for the player to make their backswing, their downswing, and then the tempo ratio at the bottom. So if you're a coach that likes to talk about tempo with your players, tempo and timing, this is a great new addition to this report. And then finally, the tile display. 70 data points, choose your favorite 4, 8, or 12, and then the data updates immediately after each shot. So speaking from a coaching perspective, somebody who's used this technology for probably about close to 8 years now, I think this is one of the most exciting things that I've seen in a long time. Now you don't have to navigate off of the capture page to relay the information to your students. As they hit shots, just like on a launch monitor, that data is going to populate. You can really start to tweak this and make it how you would coach. So you don't have to have the same tiles up there. You can choose whatever you want to see. If you like to coach based on combinations or matchups, you can start to put up there, upper body rotation and wrist flexion extension. Whatever the matchups you're looking to work on with that player, you can put them up there and they'll see it after every shot. So really cool stuff with the tiles. Okay, so our main presentation today, this morning, we're going to be going into correlating the body and the wrist and how they affect the golf club. Again, Jason and I put together this presentation with the understanding that everybody coaches differently. You have different things that you look at. So these are just some commonalities that we have found using launch monitors and K-Coach.
And the generalities are movements regardless of anything else. So if we add it's bend, it's not as the swing moves, it's just if you see this move, it will do this motion. Now as we change planes, things change, so it's constantly flowing and moving. So just making sure that you have the understanding of if you see this number, it can influence this as far as it goes, but all the things change as we rotate and move through space. So it's each part influences another part. You can never change one thing in a vacuum. So no matter what, if you change one thing, it's going to change everything up the chain from there. So just remember, we're talking general basics here of, hey, what's turn, rotation, side bend, flexion, extension, and the deviations. We're going to first define the club face, club path, and angle of attack, just to make sure we're all kind of on the same page, same definition. Definitions actually come from the TrackMan education. Then we're going to talk about how the bend, side bend, rotation, flexion extension of the wrist, and ulnar radial deviation of the wrist influence those things.
Okay, so some definitions real quick to go through. Club face is the direction the club face is pointed right or left at impact and is measured relative to the target line. Club path is the direction the club head is moving right or left at impact and is also measured relative to that target line. And angle of attack is the up or down movement of the club head at the time of max compression. Attack angle is measured relative to the horizon line. Okay?
So first thing we're going to talk about is bend. When we talk about bend, bend is positive or forward bend. This would be negative bend. It doesn't matter. So if I add rotation here, forward bend, backward bend, it's always think the center of your chest going down or up. Same thing with the hips. And as we do this, what we're going to talk about is low amounts of bend and high amounts of bend. So think of it from a posture. If we're looking at just the pelvis, if you have somebody who doesn't bend at the hips very much, or stands tall in the chest, some of the different patterns we're going to see is if you just move there, the club face is going to go more open from less bend. It's going to close with more bend, because as you lower things down, the club face is going to close. What we're going to do is the path is going to want to be negative, and finally the angle of attack will be shallowing. So if you're taking bend away from a person as they move, it's going to want to shallow the club. Yeah, so we were just talking, like, as we get to bend from a relative point, the chances are with wrist and some of the things that change that the face will want to open. Well, this will come as we get into the wrist. As the hands get lower, as you add radial deviation, you go into extension, which opens the face. So kind of looking at those on a vacuum level, that's what we're talking about. Because the higher I bend, if my club face is here, the higher I bend, or the more I bend, the more it wants to change. You can also look at this as a relationship. Think of posture, why we harp on posture so much in all of our education, all of our certs. When you look at this, you can look at the differences between the two numbers, because the standard we have for neutral posture would be about 20-40 is kind of the norm as far as that goes, 20 degrees difference. If you have somebody who has really high pelvic bend and really low torso bend, if the difference is less than 15, those things are going to be a lot closer associated with the low numbers. If you have a guy who's S or C, the definition of C posture, so low hip bend, high trunk bend, that's going to associate much closer with the high bend numbers. So look at those relationships between. So if you're capturing and you look at the posture or look at how they move, as the numbers change, that's going to influence what the club's doing. As I said, nothing happens in a vacuum. But from a posture standpoint at address, that's why you see that the C posture is going to want to move the club this way, or sorry, S posture is going to want to move the club in, C posture wants to move the club up, unless they lose posture right from the get-go.
So impact of side bend. When side bend is moving away or is negative, it's going to make the club face want to close. The club path will move a bit more negative, and then the angle of attack will steepen, right? So for a right-handed golfer, if the trail hip is staying higher, these are some of the effects that we'll start to see. Opposite for when side bend is a little bit more on the positive side. So for a right-handed golfer, when the lead hip gets a little bit higher, club face wants to open a bit more. The path will move a bit more to the positive side, and then the angle of attack will shallow.
Yeah. So just remember in our software that if this is side bend this way, lead side, so whatever the lead side is of the golfer, if I'm a right-handed golfer, if my lead side goes down, that's negative. If my lead side goes up, that's positive. In our software, that's what we mean by positive and negative in that statement.
The relationship between the pelvis and the upper body in regards to side bend. When looking at the side bend numbers of the pelvis and the upper body side bend will tend to have a greater influence of the movements of the face path and angle of attack in the backswing. So, Jason, I know you talk about that a lot, so why don't you go through that a little bit more?
Yeah. So you'll see a lot of things like hips stay high, hips stay low. I can have a really low side bend, but if I raise up and rotate out, which we see a lot of players do, losing posture but collapsing the lead side, it's the club path, the angle of attack, and the face are related more to what happens here than what happens down here. So, like I can dip this side, but if I stay in good angles, I'll be okay. If I go steeper, that influences it, but if I go flat, I can go flatter from here too, even though I collapse this side. So pay attention to a lot of what's going on in the upper body when it comes to side bend, especially in the backswing. The hips can do a lot of things, but the upper body is going to control a lot more of the face angle of attack. On the downswing, the hips early on actually will flip, and they'll have more control early on in the transition. So each part is, we could probably have this discussion for 8 hours, just of how everything works together as a time. Like I said, we're trying to keep this very general as far as basics for you to understand. Hey, if I've seen crazy side bend numbers one way or another in the reports and the evaluation, and this player's struggling with like super steep or super shallow path, then here's places for us to go find those problems quickly.
So what you're saying is the upper body has more of an influence for sure?
On side bend, in the backswing. On side bend, in the backswing.
And the side bend relationship between the pelvis and the upper body is pretty direct, right? So when you go lead hip high, you're going to see there's a counterbalance action happening with the body, right? So those two movements of the lower body and the upper body are very tied together. So that's just what we're trying to pay attention to. So as Jason mentioned, backswing for the upper body, pay more attention, and then we'll go through the transition here in a little bit, and you'll see how what the pelvis does in transition is really going to affect what happens there as well, right? Because that counterbalancing.
Turn. We had some good discussions about turn even last night. Is if you're just rotating, we're thinking just from a flat perspective of turn here. So positive turn will open the club face, negative turn will close the club face. So just lower rotation numbers do that same thing if you're looking at all the different places in backswing, the total number, impact, what are they rotated, that influences those. The turn in the backswing, the higher the number of turn in the backswing, the more inside the club wants to come. Okay? The lower the number of turn, the more outside the club wants to go. So just, if you're looking at these numbers, and ultimately we're going to talk about this later, but we'll touch on it now. Balance is the key. If you have a person who has a bunch of one piece and doesn't have the correctives to change that piece out, they're going to have that problem. So just because a number is out of range, if that's an out of range number, but it does the opposite of what the guy's trying to do, that's probably a good thing in their swing. Because if I take that away and I give them another to the negative side, so say they have a rotation number that should shallow them out, and they have 8 other steeps, don't take the one shallowing mechanism away from them. We want to find some of the other problem areas. Because the best thing is I want to balance out my steeps and shallows. I want to be able to balance this stuff out. I don't care what the numbers are, as long as the closer I get to the balance, the better we are. The guys who are in more balance are our better ball strikers. The guys who are out of balance, it doesn't matter. And sometimes we don't want to make things look pretty. I'd rather make them effective. So that's a huge part of when we start looking at all these numbers.
Bit more on turn. So turn at transition. We talked about transition. Jason just mentioned how things are going to change a little bit about what happens in that phase. So if the pelvis starts to transition before the upper body, the path will start to move more positive, the club face will open a bit, and the angle of attack will shallow out. Okay? On the opposite side, you get your players that are over the top, let's say, okay? And the upper body is going to transition before the pelvis. Path is going to go more negative. It's going to start to go outward too soon. The club face will close and the angle of attack will steepen. Okay, so again, it's a timing thing, right? We know, as Jason mentioned, players have different shallows, have different steeps, right? But the timing of when you apply shallows and steeps become very critical in the golf swing, because if you have an upper body that turns before the pelvis, and let's say you have a severe over the top and they start to get that negative path, closed club face, and especially the steep angle of attack, well, later on in the downswing, they're going to have to do something to counteract that, right? So that's where you start to see players go this way and then stand up out of their posture trying to shallow it out at the last second. Again, not very efficient or very effective, so pay attention to the steeps and shallows, but really pay attention to when in the golf swing the steeps and shallows are being applied relative to that player's pattern.
And it's really important. That transition sequence is very important to that. Like I was showing you, I can keep my elbows in, I can try to lay off the club and do things. It's easy to do if I get here and my hips go first. It helps the club clear that direction. Even if I try to keep my hands in, if I fire my upper body first, I have to really manufacture that club coming back down. So if you have somebody who's steeper, I would look at transition sequence. If that's upper body first, that's a pretty good place to start. Because if I just get them to move that lower body, it'll naturally fix that without them having. It's hard to manipulate that on the way down. There's just not enough time.
So turn at impact, some correlations. Again, we're speaking in terms of turn independently. There are other factors that can go into this, but higher turn numbers will generally lead to a little bit more of an open club face. Player turns more, okay, gets more open. It's going to delay what happens later on down the chain with the arms and the wrists. Negative path, as well as a shallower angle of attack. Lower turn numbers are going to lead to the opposite, more of a closed club face, positive path, and steeper angle of attack.
Yeah. And you can see this also in the relationship and that spine rotation number. So at impact, high negative numbers is going to be much more like the higher turn at impact. So think hips much more out in front of the shoulders. So if the hips are 50, the shoulders are 20, and vice versa. The guys who are past, I mean, honestly, if you see a couple of people whose shoulders are more closed than their hips at impact, I've done this for 15 years. I can count on one hand, I think, how many good players I've seen do that. I've seen a lot of bad players do it.
Impact of wrist flexion extension. This one's pretty direct. More flexion of the lead wrist, it's going to close the club face down. More extension will open the club face. Then when we add that to deviation, radial deviation will have a negative club path impact, steepens the angle of attack. Vice versa for ulnar deviation, positive club path, and shallows the angle of attack. One thing to note about the wrists, Jason, you can demonstrate kind of both wrists if you want to put the club down.
And everybody should try this. So if you take both hands, just both hands out, if you go down, what you'll start to see is the harder you flex, the more the thumb wants to kind of move away from you, just naturally. If you turn that up, that's ulnar deviation. Flexion ties into ulnar deviation with the wrist through range of motion. So the structure of the wrist. If we go extension, you'll notice when if you turn your hands up, your thumbs are more pointed back towards you. So if I want to set the wrist by structure of the wrist, this is anatomy, you're gonna probably have to go into some extension unless they have crazy amounts of range of motion in the wrist joint itself. The natural in the human population is if I go flexion, I'm also going to go into ulnar deviation. If I go extension, I'm going to go into radial deviation. Kind of a hard thing to fight when we're trying to always get flat lead wrist at the top and try to get wrist set. So it shows you how hard that actually is on people to do and how much strength it takes to get flat lead wrist set.
So this will show why, all our students watch golf on TV. They're saying, I've got to get to that parallel position at the top. They don't have the range of motion to get there, but they're trying their best. So all of a sudden they have a wide open club face because they're hinging more than they can in terms of their range of motion. The wrist goes into too much extension. Then they, again, if you couple that with that transition stuff we talked about, and then they have the upper body transitioning before the lower body, well, now we've got that open club face, and we start to get that over the top look, right? And it's very hard to recover from that. So coupling that together, again, range of motion of the player is going to play a huge part in this, right? So if you have players that are trying to get to that parallel position at the top or whatever they're trying to do, they might not have the range of motion to do that. So it might simply be kind of gearing back on that so that you can keep more connection with the club so that that club face isn't going to open because of that extension, okay?
And one thing to remember, we do a lot of grip strength testing where I am. The average tour player is over 60 kilograms per square centimeter. The average adult male is 40. So even when the tour player is holding the club lightly, their grip strength, if they're even 80%, they're still 50. They're still better than the average grip strength of the adult male. So they're strong. They're able to do a lot more of this hand manipulation than the person who's going to walk in off the street. The average male I test is in the upper 30s. So just to give you an example of probably who most of you are dealing with coming with the club pros, and that is that their grip strength is very, very low. A simple thing to do is you can give them like tennis balls to squeeze, the putty, stuff like that, and you'll be amazed also how much more club face control they might establish because of just getting stronger in the hands. So as we talked on before, all these things can help or hinder. You can have too much of one or the other. The biggest thing we care about is balance. You want to balance these things out. So if you know the steeps or the shallows or the opens and closes and all that, like I said, check the numbers. Look at the numbers as a whole. The more you practice it, the better you'll get. And also you'll pick out things of like, oh man, I saw four steepeners and only one shallower. Oh, no wonder this guy's over the top. Well, which one of those steepeners can I maybe change into a shallow and not give them balance? What you'll find is their ball striking will improve very rapidly as soon as you get them into balance. It allows them to make these adjustments, to be kind of more athletic on the fly. And that's what we want is the players to ultimately think less. You have less going on up here when they're trying to swing a golf club and just kind of reacting to what they're doing, because that's actually what their body's doing in their swing faults. Because also they may have a concept issue where they've added all these things that make them steep, and now at the end all of a sudden they're like, oh crap, get up and out. So they're using their athleticism just to make contact at that point. So if we can take some of that overcompensation away, it helps smooth things out quite a bit.
And for your club golfer, use these combinations or matchups as a way to work around, a lot of the things we have to deal with as coaches, right? We're dealing with physical limitations all the time or poor motor patterns over a long period of time. So I think the matchups really kind of free you up as a coach to be able to get to the end result in a number of different ways. So don't look at it as an absolute, like Jason had said, or in a vacuum, one thing at a time. Use those matchups, and there's going to be many ways to get to the same end result for the player.
You were talking about the peer ranges. What criteria make up that peer range?
Age and gender is the two criteria right now. We might add to that, but we started with that alone.
There's work of trying to formulate everybody's data together, at least like the generic stuff, so we can pick out handicaps, ages, get more and more people. But I know doing reports with my clientele, I joke, is 25 and younger and 55 plus. I have the kids playing competitive golf, trying to become professional, couple, and then it's the guys who have established their lifestyle, your club members. And half the guys who are 60 are like, why are you comparing me to a tour guy? I'm not trying to play tour, I'm not going to be tour. So we took that as, well, let's show you what the other guys in your peer group are doing. So at least you can kind of say, here's what the average 60-year-old does. It should make communication with your student better. That was the whole goal of the evaluation, is to make it easier for you to communicate with your student, and then for your student to understand what you're communicating to them.
And you can decide what to compare them to, right? You might have a student that's super competitive and they want to see the pro range, right? Well, by all means, you can, show them that, but then bring them back a notch and say, well, here's where we are today, here's where the peer range is. We'd like to get closer to that pro range, of course, but let's start looking at this first, and it can make that process a little bit easier for you.
When do you see rotation start with the thorax and the pelvis in relation to transition? So, when the Cubs change direction.
It's a couple frames. It's a couple frames right at the very stop. Most of the time the club is still moving backwards slightly when the hips start to transition the other way.
So you're talking about the correlation between the lateral and the rotation, right? So, and you're speaking in an ideally what you'd like to see. Jason said a couple frames. I always look to see that lateral shift occur just before the rotation starts. That's what I like to see. But then closely after that, the pelvis is going to start to rotate. And again, there's factors in play here, right? Player's flexibility is going to determine, how much rotation occurs between the lower body and the upper body, or when the timing is. But I look to see that shift occur, earlier, and then right after that, the rotation start.
And I joke, because if you do look at like pelvic side bend graph, the earlier you start to see it go from negative to positive, typically the better. The people who continue down through the transition, that'll be in. I have 6 DOF systems that we run. That's what I've been running for 15 years. When we see guys who are late, or had that side bend low, the vertical pressure happens really late. We don't see much lift out of those players at impact. So, and also the other thing is as I start to add lead side bend, as it switches from this side to this side, it actually, remember how the wrist has things? Well, that actually promotes rotation. So vertical force and lead side bend promote lead hip rotation.
How long in the swing do you like to see the trail hip high?
I like to see it start to change in transition, or actually just before the top marker for our system, right?
Oh, really?
Yes, Jason.
But that could be the trail hip lowering, not so much the lead hip raising, right? Which gets you into the ground.
Oh, right, yeah,
Yep.
exactly.
Yep.
I mean, lead hip's not really raising that early. The trail hip might be lower.
Lower.
I mean, in that point, we could get into ankle mechanics and things like that. A lot of people don't. We have a whole generation of people with flat feet. What we see the best players, the foot actually rolls in first, and that's actually the lateral shift. And that helps me drop this hip, raise this hip. And if you don't have that, most people go there first. And that's going to push the trail hip up. And that'll keep the lead hip down on the graph. So that's for your video.
And for most of your club golfers, that right hip staying high for too long is the start to that over the top move, and it's really hard to recover from that. So I tend to look, this is something on the personal side, coaching for me, when I'm looking at the pelvis graph, I like to see the rotation get back to square, and the side bend get back to about level, about the middle of the downswing, and right around the same amount of time.
Like lead arm parallel?
Lead arm
Yeah,
parallel
lead arm parallel would be a good,
is side bend to 0, rotation to 0, maximum rotational velocity
right.
of the
So
pelvis.
lead arm back to parallel. If you're talking about 60, if you want to add that in, I'll call it level, low, and square, right? So at its lowest point, level, and back to square.
You find that they can create the most vertical force if you do
It really helps
Yep.
it.
Yep.
Really helps.
Yeah, we'll get guys that are 1.8, 1.9, like in the pressure stuff. It's almost twice their body weight if they do that really well. I mean, those are your guys, I mean, that are going to swing at 125 that weigh $150. You know, besides their athleticism, they just, I mean, you're Justin Thomas. They're leaving the ground. They're putting so much pressure into the ground at that point. But it's hard to, if you try to, I mean, play with that with yourself. Try to put yourself in some of these positions and say, could I jump from here? And everybody's going to go back to here because they're going to be like, this is where you feel powerful. But unfortunately in golf, because we're swinging everything else and there's so many outside influences, and that's where they miss.
Great question. Yeah. Anything else?
You had speed generation, consistency. What numbers of what? How do they relate to handicap?
The speed generation numbers, it's more in some of the speed gains in the sequencing. The overall speed numbers vary greatly within peer groups and areas. The consistency scores, we'll talk more about this. I look for, at address, really low numbers. So like, I always say under 2. At the top, I want like under 3. At impact, I want under 5. And wrist, I'm under 6. If you're looking through that consistency page, that's what I'm looking for. If I see somebody at address, and in 5 swings, they're varying 5 or 6 degrees, that's a lot. Think about 5 or 6 degrees at path, changing it from -2 to +3. And that's a huge move, but it doesn't look like much. The one thing I'll always tell you is we're talking degrees here. 1 minute on a clock is 6 degrees. It's a very, very small number. When you actually look at a clock, think of how small that is and how much influence it has over what's going on. And so at the wrist, we're going to have bigger variation because it's a smaller, think of it like a wristwatch 1 minute versus a big clock of 1 minute. Your hips are more the big clock, the wrist is more the wristwatch. So those variations, as you get to smaller joints, we give you a little more play. Bigger joints, static motion, we'd want that range to be really small.
The benchmarks you gave?
I say 2 for address, under 2, under 3 for top, under 5 for impact, and under 6 for any of the wrists. It's kind of it's a working guideline from playing with the evaluation because, again, we've seen this not a whole lot longer than what you've seen it. So now we've been trying to get as much data captures. I'm lucky I have a pretty captive audience where I work. We have 50 members that I see every week. And so I'm constantly just throwing them on, just trying to see what's going on. And the evaluation takes 5 minutes, so they get to delay 5 minutes of working out.
Are the pro ranges, because I thought I saw this one piece of the evaluation tool, different in the evaluation tool than they are in the original swing summary?
A little bit, yeah. They're going to be bigger in the evaluation tool. They're wider. Again, we had a previous database that we were working with, which was smaller than Dr. Neal's. So looking at Dr. Neal's at the pro ranges, there is a wider discrepancy.
So are you going to change the swing summary ones?
We'll tweak it as we go along, but this was the starting point. Yeah.
And remember, just because they're professionals doesn't mean they don't fall outside of ranges. Right? An average for range is 1 standard deviation. That means 66%. So even of the PGA Tour averages, 33% of them are outside of those ranges at some point. That's why I said where the balance is key. I don't always care about the numbers. The balance of those numbers is key for that. So like the one we're going to tweak right away is the upper body bend at top because the number is huge. And actually, we do know if you go too much into the negative there, you will have low back problems. I've done this for 15 years. I've met one guy who had a negative number that didn't have back problems. 1 in 15 years. And the only reason he didn't have back problems is they joked that he had a massive pause at the top of a swing. Well, he paused and he didn't start accelerating until he actually got back into positive bend. It was so weird. I actually sent it to Greg and was like, dude, we've been doing this for a long time. Have you seen this? So.
Yeah, what type of database do you have on wrist angles from tour players right now, or are you still kind of collecting that?
Me personally, I think I have 60 or 70 guys, but I mean, I typically capture, when I'm with them, 20 to 40 swings. So, I mean, we have a decent amount. I can tell you from flexion extension, the average at the top is 9 extended to 30 extended. So even though this is the difference, when you see on camera, remember 6 degrees at the wrist is really tiny. So 9 degrees, it would look like a flat wrist based on camera angle. It might even look slightly bowed. But the average we have, and we digitize all the joint lines, is 9 extended to 34 extended.
I heard an interesting interview that Steve Stricker gave to a golf coach a while back. And he said he moved his grip from turn more to the right, which would make it easier to have extension at the top, to a little more like Jordan's feet, a little flatter, not weaker, still in the fingers, but a little flatter here, because he felt like, well, I don't have to do as much twisting up here. He just could leave it there. What do you think of that for people who have range of motion issues in wrist? Because I work with a lot of like people own their own concrete businesses and bricklayers, and man, their motion is horrendous. Like if you put them in a grip like that, they can't twist on it enough at all. So I actually make them grip it a little bit more like that because they just don't have the range of motion in that wrist. Where I make them go like that with that wrist.
Does everybody here know what you should look for in a wrist screen? I know TPI shows it. Everybody familiar with that? Lie angle of a 5 or a 6 iron is what normal is. Extension, deviation. What I look for is that you get almost flat here, and then here I just want to see it come back. It's only actually 20 degrees. But if you screen your player and all of a sudden you're like, hey, do flexion for me, and they're like this. Yeah. Remember, your body doesn't want to live at endpoints. If it's at the end, it wants to go back to where it's the middle of that range of motion. That's where it's most comfortable. It's strongest in the middle. Think about if you do pull-ups, where is it hardest to do pull-ups? Here and at the very end. You're really good in here. The body is strongest in the middle of a range. So yeah, if you had that guy who had almost no flexion, you might take him the other way. Just because now you give him a little bit of room to do this. If he has no flexion and now he goes the other way too much, he's more likely to, because as soon as he hits that end point, the response is to go back to the middle. That's reflexes. The body doesn't like endpoints. Yes?
You see the majority of people at extension at the top and longer hitters that you look at?
Yeah, I mean, you're going to see some more, like I said, extension is going to go with radial deviation, so you're going to have a little more wrist set. So you might get a little more loading of the club, loading of the shaft. And, it kind of comes into same thing as, they talk about lead thumb and the long drive guys there's a lot of extension there that helps them with power. But that wrist set, I mean, I could use my own swing, for example. I have crazy amounts of wrist lag. Helps me hit the ball really far with high club head speeds, but it's bad for irons. So it's just one of those things that, so trying to play with that stuff is tough. You have to adjust. But yeah, typically longer hitters, they try to get a little more, it's another gear, right? Same reason the long drive guys, we actually teach them to bend their elbows. It's because now I can extend the elbow, that's another gear. I wouldn't teach that if I want to hit it straight. Try to coordinate one more thing. But if your goal is long drive, shoot, yeah, bend away.
But I think a key takeaway, especially for the club golfer, is something that Jason said in terms of the concept of what the wrist actually is doing at the top, and it is more extended than the person probably thinks. Because they see the flat left wrist, they hear it all the time, they hear about Dustin Johnson and bowing the wrist. For majority of them, get them into a little bit more extension, get them into that middle of the range, so then they actually have some room to flex it on the way down, right? Which when you get into that phase of the swing, it's going to affect impact a lot more than them having it at the top and then letting it go closer down to impact.
Because halfway down, the data is 12 flex to 6 extended.
I'll draw the center mass of the club behind
Yeah. Exact. So they right away. Yeah. When we look at the graphs, yeah, as soon as they start transition, that motorcycle kind of kicks on.
I'm sorry, one more quick question.
And then Jason. Yeah.
Because I haven't really messed with this too much. When you have forward hand press, you know, guys have a little late forward hand press before they get almost like they're triggered. Do you try to time the set address and capture it at that moment, or do you just kind of be careful in how you look at the data as they go in that backswing?
So the set address on our system, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, like, I just like, what do you guys typically like to do when you see guys? Like, I see like guys that have that late trigger, they push forward,
Right.
and then they take it back. So it might,
Right. So
it might like give you some different data, but
yeah, I use auto capture all the time, right? So that auto capture, yeah. So that way you don't have to try and time it. Exactly. Yeah.
John,
Yeah.
is it possible for you to show us what he's talking about? If you got captures there, that whatever he's saying, can you show us what he's talking about?
The forward press. Yeah, I don't know if I have a capture on here that has a forward press, but
What he's talking about is the guys who do.
So yeah, a lot, like, especially like with wedges, and if you work on
Yeah.
wedge shots with guys, and they do it, I like, you see a lot of guys just do it. Sometimes
Yeah, you-
with different triggers, they might actually drag the club, they can't handle the club hold back, and you might get that, you know, that lead wrist extension.
right. So Tony, in the kinematic sequence, you'll see very early in the takeaway, instead of the lines going down in the kinematic sequence, they might go up very briefly and then start to go down. So if you get a player with, a big forward press, the rotation's obviously going this way first before it works away. So that's the most common thing you'll see. Absolutely. Jason?
Can you just walk through how you're calibrating to get the wrist measurements?
The wrist, yeah, for sure. So there's a slight difference in the wrist calibration than in the body. So with the body, historically, you set up square to your calibrated target line with the club down at your waist. With the wrist, you don't need a club actually, okay? So you can still stand straight up and down. Let your wrist just hang naturally down at your side like this, okay? Just so that the sensors are still square to that target line, but you don't want a rigid structure because we're actually calibrating the natural hanging position of the wrist. So if the player's wrist starts out in a little bit of extension or a little bit more this way, we're factoring that in so that we get the actual wrist angle all the way through. So you don't want to manipulate that to be completely square and changed based on the shaft. So just hang your hands down just like this and then calibrate that way. Okay, and that'll...
You want knuckles parallel to the...
Yeah, knuckles parallel. Yep, exactly. I wouldn't use the club, right? That would be better. And then the set address, just so everybody knows, if you're working on wrist angles in the software, all the set address does is makes the avatar look realistic. We're not recalibrating the wrists at address. So it's just switching the avatar around so it actually looks realistic for when you're doing your training. So all the calibration is done when you hit the calibration button.
And then we want the sensors square.
Yeah, go ahead.
So then you want the sensors square to each other. So I'll walk around just so you can see it. So if I'm hanging here, you can see they're in the same vertical orientation. That helps. So
even when the vest is on, Joe, you can still just let everything just hang like that.
Yep.
Do everything.
Yeah, because this upper body and lower body is still going to be the same, right? Whether you have a club here or you're just hanging your arms down naturally. If you're capturing wrist angles or if you're in golf lead wrist mode, just make sure, as Jason said, they're relatively square to one another over the top in a vertical line. Typically kind of down the line of the middle finger, right around there. Okay. And then just, again, knuckles to the target line. Again, because remember, we're not talking about this right now, right? We're just talking about flexion, extension, and deviation. Okay. So just hang them down naturally, and then whatever that hanging position is, it's going to calibrate it in for that individual player's wrist angle.
And I know we've spoken about this on the phone, that once you calibrate them and they get into their position and they actually go into their address position, most of the numbers are very skewed when it comes to posture and it comes to address.
In which way?
You want to just go through that again.
You mean when they go into...
Once they calibrate it, it buzzes and everything's great, and as soon as they grab the club and you see when it does auto capture and you look at it, most of the alignment and most of their posture readings are mostly like 50%, 40%. And you told me it's because of the rib cage and it was a couple of things.
Oh, you're talking about the rotation at address.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I'll go over that real quick. Just let me get real...
Question on calibration.
Yeah.
Joe, so you're going to capture pelvis, upper body and stuff. Do you calibrate the wrist first without the club and then use the club to calibrate?
You can do it all at the same time.
Well,
One
but you said
calibration.
you shouldn't use the club when you're calibrating the wrist. Because
No club when you're calibrating the wrist. But you don't need, so you don't need to do this, right, to calibrate the upper body and lower body because you're still in the same position. Just no club, right, if you're in golf lead wrist.
and everything will be calibrated.
Yep, exactly.
And I've tried that, Paul, with no club with just a lead arm capture now, and it works the same. The data I'm getting is the same. The other thing with this wrist sensor, I'll actually put, this is my personal preference, is I'll put the hand sensor on first and have them go into extension and then put the lead wrist on because I don't want them to hit each other, but I want them as close to each other as possible. Does that make sense? So if you make them kind of do that, you know they're not going to run into the pieces because last thing you want is to get it too close and have the first swing and they're like, hey, something's pushing into my hand.
So let me quickly go over the rotation thing. So for those of you that go into live mode, okay, so whenever the avatar is live, whether it be biofeedback or live measure mode, it's talking about rotation in terms of a global reference line, okay? So if I calibrated that target line and I closed 10 degrees to it, -10 would be the number. If I opened 10 degrees would be the number. When you're looking at your graphs or your reports and you see address positions with rotation numbers, especially of the upper body, that are a little bit more open than you think you might need to see, between 7 and 13 I think is the range. The reason is in measure mode we're using a different coordinate system. We're using actually a local coordinate system. So what happens is when you have flexion and you add side bend, the rib cage of the player will open up slightly when you add those two movements together. That's why you're seeing a little bit more of an open position at address. That does not mean, let's say it was 13, positive 13. That does not mean that the player was 13 degrees open to their target line at address. That just means that based on how much bend they had and how much side bend they had, the rib cage was set slightly open. So don't tell them that they're misaligned because we would be telling them something wrong. So just keep that in mind. So it's just how the human body is built, right? So when you add these two movements together, it's going to slightly open up that rib cage.
You can see the difference.
And the reason why we see it more in the upper body than the pelvis is because we have more bend and more side bend.
Just a little.
Yeah. You all could be on your way, and thank you for coming. No problem. You got it.